Today we're looking at three of the most prolific serial killers in US history. There's a boxer who took the lives of 61 women, a killer who managed to stay active for over 15 years, and a killer nurse who targeted his own patients. And the usual warning, the content in this video may be distressing for some, so discretion is advised. And before we start, if you're interested in stories from the dark side of life, please remember to like and subscribe so you can be the first to hear about all the future videos posted by this channel. Okay, let's go. Samuel Little is confirmed to have murdered 61 women across 19 states, making him the most prolific serial killer in US history based upon the number of confirmed victims. Although he was officially linked to 61 murders, Little himself confessed to having killed 93 women. His deviancy started young. When he was a child, he had sexual fantasies about strangling women, and as a teenager began to hoard true crime magazines depicting women being choked. A former competitive boxer, Little would knock his victims out with punches and strangle them, often sexually gratifying himself in the process. Little was charged with his first murder in October 1982. 22-year-old Melinda Lepre was a sex worker living in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Her body was later found in a cemetery. Despite other sex workers in the area claiming to have been choked by a man matching Little's description, a lack of evidence meant he was never indicted for Melinda's murder. Years later, he confessed he was the killer. But he soon got away with murder again. In January 1984, Little is tried for the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Mount, who was murdered in September 1982, the month before he'd killed Julie. And despite Patricia having spent the evening of her death dancing with a man matching Little's description, and strands of his hair being found on her clothing, the evidence is still considered weak. The trial lasts only 2 days before Little is acquitted. In late 1984, he is sent to prison for attacking 2 different women at 2 different times. Released in 1987, Little moved to Los Angeles, where he committed at least 10 more murders. He gets away with a string of murders before finally being apprehended in 2012, when his DNA is matched to that found on 3 victims who had been killed 2 decades earlier. Found guilty in 2014, he is sentenced to life imprisonment, but there are more revelations to come. After being in prison for 4 years, at the end of 2018, Little made a shocking revelation. Between 1970 and 2005, he'd killed tens of women who authorities hadn't even noticed were missing. He gave the names of dozens of women he'd murdered across 19 different states, police eventually confirming that he was responsible for 34 of these. But he's still not finished. Little then starts to confess to more murders, as only skeletal remains from these women were recovered, and Little either didn't remember or even know their names. He tried to aid their identification by drawing portraits of them from his memory. In total, he drew over 30 portraits that were later released by the FBI, which led to at least 1 woman since being identified. Little stated he believed he got away with his murders for so long because he killed women on the fringes of society, often prostitutes or drug addicts, and because of their lifestyles and lack of physical wounds when they were found, most of their deaths were attributed to overdoses or accidental causes. Little would say, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that. I stayed in the ghettos." Little died of natural causes on December the 30th, 2020. He was 80 years of age. With 49 confirmed victims, Gary Ridgway is the second most prolific serial killer in US history. And like Samuel Little, his true number of victims may be far higher, as he confessed to killing 71 teenage girls and women. Ridgway is often referred to as the Green River Killer, after the river in Washington, as that's where his first 5 victims were found. Like many serial killers, Ridgway had a traumatic start in life. He would often witness violence in the family home, and this affected him so badly that up until the age of 13, he had a bedwetting problem. At 16 years of age, Ridgway attacks his first victim. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the local woods and stabbed him. Thankfully, the boy survived. Ridgway was married and divorced 3 times. 2 of the wives and other romantic interests reported that Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite. He also had an obsession with sex workers. Active in Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, most of his victims were sex workers or teenage runaways. Ridgway would pick up the victims and usually either take them to his home, remain with them in his truck, or drive them to a secluded area. They would often engage in sexual activity, after which Ridgway would murder them. One of his most frequently used tactics was to work his way behind a woman during intercourse, and then strangle her by placing his arm around her neck. After they had died, he would usually dump the bodies in wooded areas, sometimes returning to have intercourse with them. On July the 8th, 1982, Ridgway commits his first confirmed murder. Wendy Caulfield was a 16-year-old runaway prostitute who had the misfortune of crossing paths with him. Her body is discovered a week later by 2 boys who are riding their bikes across a bridge over the Green River. They see her tennis shoes sticking out of the water, and the cause of her death is strangulation. Her own jeans are tied around her neck. Over the next few months, it's clear there's a serial killer in the area, as another 4 women are discovered murdered in the river. Ridgway's last confirmed victim, Patricia Yellowrobe, was murdered in January 1998. He took her life as he claimed that she failed to satisfy him sexually. In all, Ridgway had been killing for over 15 years. Ridgway first became a suspect for the murders in 1983. He submits to a polygraph test in 1984, but after successfully passing it, he was released. It would take another 8 years for him to be brought to justice. He is finally arrested in November 2001. Using a DNA sample Ridgway had given detectives in 1987, they found matches on 4 of the murdered women, and Ridgway was apprehended. To spare his life from the death penalty, he made a plea to disclose the locations of his other victims, eventually pleading guilty to 48 murders. He was handed a life sentence, which he is still serving to this day. After sentencing, Ridgway confessed to having murdered a total of 71 teenage girls and women. Hopefully some more of these will be found and identified in the future. But why did he choose prostitutes and runaways? In his own words, they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away. I might never be reported missing. I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. Donald Harvey was convicted of 37 murders, making him 4th in the list of US serial killers by number of victims. And he claims to have killed far more. 87 people in total. Unlike the previous two serial killers in today's video, Donald Harvey didn't need to search for his victims. He had easy access to them. He worked as an orderly in various hospitals, and the patients would make up the majority of his victims. Harvey said that he first began smothering patients to death in order to ease their pain. However, he soon began to enjoy it and started to murder for fun, self-describing himself as an angel of death. Contrary to many serial killers, Harvey didn't rely on just one method to kill. Instead, his murders took many different forms, including, but not restricted to, administering poisons, turning off ventilators, and inserting coat hangers into catheters. He started killing as a teenager. In 1970, an 18-year-old Harvey started working at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky, and would claim the life of his first victim on May the 31st that year. 88-year-old Logan Evans was in the hospital receiving treatment after suffering a stroke. Enraged that Logan had earlier smeared feces on him, Harvey smothers him with a plastic sheet and a pillow. After he died, Harvey disposed of the plastic sheet, dressed Evans in a clean gown, and then alerted hospital staff of the death. Nobody seemed to suspect any foul play. In the short 10 months he worked there, Harvey claimed he killed a minimum of 12 people. Over the next 17 years, Harvey continues to kill patients in the 3 hospitals that employ him. Although many of his victims were hospital patients, Harvey also targeted people in his private life too. When he suspected his lover, Carl Howler, of infidelity, Harvey poisoned him with cyanide so that he would be too ill to leave their apartment. Carl survives, passing away in 2015 from unrelated causes. 2 of Carl and Donald's mutual friends would also become targets. Diana Alexander had her tea laced with a hepatitis serum after Harvey believed she was causing problems between himself and Carl. She survived, but suffered from hepatitis for the rest of her life. However, the next friend he targets dies. Believing Helen Metzger was a threat to Carl, Donald laced a pie with arsenic. Both she and her father eat the pie, and they both later die. Harvey targeted his final hospital victim in March 1987, and this is the murder where his crimes were finally uncovered. 44-year-old John Powell died abruptly after spending several months receiving treatment following a motorbike accident. An autopsy revealed large amounts of cyanide in his system. Harvey confessed to police that he was responsible for John's death, but claimed he did so as a mercy killing. Investigations eventually reveal that Harvey is responsible for a string of murders, and sadly a lot of them could have been prevented. Several nurses had raised concerns about the spike in deaths that occurred whenever Harvey was on duty, but they were ordered to keep quiet by hospital administrators. Harvey eventually pleaded guilty to a total of 37 murders and was given 28 life sentences. He died in March 2017 after being beaten to death by another inmate. The inmate saying he did so in order to give peace and closure to the families of Harvey's victims. Those were 3 of the worst serial killers to have ever lived in the US. Do you have any thoughts about any of the stories? If so, share them in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please remember to like and subscribe to be informed of any future videos posted by this channel. Until then.